In the grand tapestry of the Ottoman Empire, a realm renowned for its grandeur, conquests, and complex political intrigue, one woman stands out as an unparalleled force in the 17th century, Hatice Kösem Sultan. While much of the world only whispers the names of powerful men, Kösem's legacy proves that even within the walls of a harem, a woman could wield influence capable of shaping the fate of an empire. Born Anastasia, a Greek girl sold into slavery, she rose to become one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history. Navigating the labyrinthine politics of the palace with skill and tenacity, her journey began in the harem of Sultan Ahmed I, where she first captured the attention of the young sultan, eventually becoming his wife and the mother of future rulers. But it was not just her familial ties that made her formidable. Kösem's ability to master the ruthless dynamics of palace politics, her strength in raising two future sultans, and her role in shaping Ottoman governance would ensure her place in history. From a slave girl to the de facto ruler of the empire, Kösem Sultan's life was not only one of personal ambition, but one of profound political maneuvering, where every decision could tip the balance of power. This is the story of Kösem Sultan's rise, her struggles, and her immense influence, both over her own family and the vast Ottoman Empire. A story of a woman whose legacy echoes through the corridors of history, challenging the conventions of her time and forever altering the trajectory of the empire she helped shape. The air of the early 17th century was thick with the promise of power and conquest in the vast Ottoman Empire. A world where fortunes could change in the blink of an eye, and lives could be shaped by the whims of emperors. But for Anastasia, a young girl born in the distant lands of Greece, none of these grand aspirations were part of her world. Born to humble parents in a small village, she lived a life that seemed as though it would follow the same simple rhythms of her ancestors, modest, unnoticed, and bound to the soil of her homeland. But fate, as it often does, had different plans for her. In the bustling streets of her village, the sound of cartwheels and merchants' calls were familiar daily companions. Yet one fateful day, a group of men arrived, their presence foreboding. They were agents of the empire, tasked with acquiring young women for the sultan's harem, where they would be trained to serve the elite. Anastasia's life, already bound by the chains of poverty, was now inextricably tied to a new form of bondage, one that would take her far from her home and into the heart of the world's most powerful empire. As she was swept away to Istanbul, she entered the gates of the Topkapi Palace, unaware of the long path that awaited her. The harem, where women from across the empire and beyond were gathered, was a world of both opulence and treachery, a world in which beauty, intelligence, and charm were not just qualities to be admired, they were weapons to be wielded. Anastasia, renamed Hatice, began her new life as one of the many concubines in the sultan's harem. She was not alone. Other young women from the farthest corners of the empire surrounded her, each with their own dreams, ambitions, and desires. The competition to catch the eye of Sultan Ahmed I, the ruler of the Ottoman Empire, was fierce. The harem was not just a place of luxury and beauty, it was a battleground where women fought for favor and position, for the chance to rise above the others and secure a place in the heart of the sultan. From the very beginning, Hatice's beauty was evident, but it was not just her looks that made her stand out. She was intelligent and resourceful, traits that quickly gained the notice of the women around her and, more importantly, the sultan. While the other women relied solely on their charm and physical allure, Hatice understood the deeper currents of power that flowed within the palace. She observed, listened, and learned. She knew that to survive in the harem, one needed more than just beauty. It was the ability to navigate the labyrinth of palace politics that truly set women apart. And it was this skill, this quiet understanding of power, that would soon set Hatice on a path unlike any other. Her early days in the harem were marked by the subtle learning of the ways of the palace. She watched as the current favorites of the sultan paraded their beauty and graced him with their presence. Yet none held his attention for long. It was always fleeting, and the older, more experienced women reminded her that even the sultan's affection was a commodity to be bartered, manipulated, and often discarded when no longer useful. Yet Hatice knew that to rise above this, she needed to be more than just another beautiful face. She needed to be strategic. It was during one of the many court events, a grand banquet in honor of the Sultan's birthday, that Hatice's fate would be sealed. The harem had gathered, as they often did, to present themselves before the Sultan. The women were adorned in silks, jewels, and the finest perfumes, each one trying to outshine the others. Hatice, however, chose simplicity. She wore a gown of deep blue, her hair cascading down her back in soft waves, untouched by the extravagant curls that others wore. She had spent the evening observing the Sultan, waiting for the right moment. And now, as the gathering was winding down, that moment had arrived, as Sultan Ahmed I stood, preparing to leave the banquet hall. Hatice stepped forward. She did not rush, nor did she seek attention in the way others might have. She simply approached him with grace, her eyes locked on his. Confident but not bold, there was something about her calm demeanor that caught the Sultan's eye. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was her quiet strength, her poise amidst the chaos of the harem, that intrigued him. "Your Highness," she said, her voice steady but soft, "I hope this night finds you well." Sultan Ahmed I, intrigued by her presence, nodded his head, signaling for her to approach. It was here that the power shift began, not in the overt gestures or grand speeches, but in the quiet exchange of a glance, a few words. Hatice had caught the Sultan's attention, not with flash or force, but with the subtlety of someone who understood how to navigate the turbulent waters of palace life. And from that moment, her life in the harem would never be the same. Her rise was swift. In the weeks that followed, Hatice became a favorite of Sultan Ahmed I. She was no longer just another concubine. She had become one of the most trusted women in his harem. It was not long before she found herself not only in the Sultan's bed but in his council as well. Her insights into palace politics, her keen understanding of the rivalries that permeated the harem, made her an invaluable asset. Sultan Ahmed I, though young, was wise enough to recognize the value of such a woman by his side. Yet, for all her newfound favor, Hatice knew that power in the harem was fleeting. It was a place where allegiances shifted as quickly as the winds of the Bosphorus, and loyalty was often measured not by words, but by the ability to secure a future. Hatice was no fool. She knew that her position in the palace could change in an instant, and that to truly secure her place in the empire, she needed something more, something that would give her a lasting foothold in the Sultan's world. That something was children. To be the mother of a sultan was to secure your place in history. To bear the next ruler of the Ottoman Empire was the ultimate form of power for a woman in the harem. And Hatice, with her beauty, intelligence, and ambition, would not let that opportunity pass by. Months after her rise to prominence, she became pregnant with Sultan Ahmed I's child. The news was met with excitement, for a new heir meant not only a future for the empire but a future for Hatice herself. The birth of her son, Murad, would mark the beginning of her true ascent, with her child secure in his place as the heir to the throne. Hatice's influence grew, and she soon became one of the most powerful women in the Ottoman Empire. As the years passed, Hatice would navigate the treacherous waters of palace politics with the same careful precision that had marked her rise. She would face rivalries, betrayals, and heartache, but through it all, one thing remained clear. Hatice Kösem Sultan was no longer just a slave girl from a distant land. She had become a woman of immense power, a queen in her own right, whose influence would shape the very destiny of the Ottoman Empire. As Hatice's place in the harem grew more prominent, so did her reputation among the women of the palace. It was a time of subtle rivalry, where loyalty was often betrayed for the sake of favor, and where every glance from the Sultan was scrutinized, judged, and measured by the others. The Sultan's attention was a coveted prize, a mark of power that could elevate anyone within the harem to an enviable position, while the absence of it could quickly lead to obscurity. Yet, for all the beauty and charm of the other women vying for his affections, there was something distinctly different about Hatice. In the years that followed her arrival at the Topkapi Palace, Hatice's intelligence and tact proved invaluable. She did not rely solely on her beauty, though it was undeniable, nor did she engage in the constant games of the harem, those desperate attempts to win favor through flattery or deceit. Instead, Hatice understood the deeper currents of power that moved within the palace walls. She studied the Sultan's moods, his preferences, and most importantly, his vulnerabilities. It was her keen awareness of these factors that would eventually set her apart from the other women and bring her into the inner circle of the Sultan's life. Sultan Ahmed I, young and driven by a desire to leave a lasting legacy, found himself drawn to Hatice in a way that he had not been with other women. Perhaps it was her calm, measured demeanor that intrigued him, or perhaps it was the quiet strength in her that seemed to resonate with his own ambitions. Whatever the reason, it was clear that Hatice was no ordinary concubine. She had a presence that commanded attention, not through loud gestures or overt displays of affection, but through the subtle ways she engaged with the world around her. As the days turned into months, the bond between Sultan Ahmed I and Hatice grew stronger. They spent time together in private, away from the eyes of the other women. Their conversations were not always about matters of the court, but often about the future of the empire, about the challenges they faced and the dreams they shared. Hatice had a mind that was as sharp as any vizier, and the Sultan came to appreciate her counsel on matters both personal and political. For Hatice, however, the growing relationship was not just about love. She understood the stakes of her position, and the opportunities that a marriage to the Sultan could offer. The harem was a place of beauty and intrigue, but it was also a battlefield, where women were constantly striving to secure their place and their future. Hatice knew that the only way to truly cement her power in the palace was through marriage to the Sultan. The mere position of being a concubine, no matter how favored, was precarious, but a marriage to the Sultan would make her a queen in her own right. A force within the empire whose influence would extend far beyond the confines of the palace. It was not long before Sultan Ahmed I, recognizing her wisdom and strength, made the decision to marry Hatice. The wedding was a grand affair, one befitting the ruler of such a vast and powerful empire. The Topkapi Palace was adorned with the finest silks and jewels, the halls echoing with music and laughter as the Sultan formally took Hatice as his wife. In that moment, she was no longer just a concubine, no longer just a woman in the harem. She was the wife of the Sultan, a position that afforded her not just luxury, but power, a power that would soon prove to be vital in the turbulent politics of the empire. Hatice's marriage to Sultan Ahmed I brought her status and influence. But it also brought her deeper into the world of the Ottoman court. A world that was far more complex and dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The politics of the empire were shifting, and with the Sultan's marriage to her, Hatice found herself at the center of a web of intrigue and competition. Not just within the harem but in the wider empire as well. She was no longer just an observer of the court's machinations, she was now a player in them. Despite her new status, Hatice did not forget the lessons of her early years in the harem. She understood that in this world, power was never guaranteed. Even a sultan's wife could be discarded if she was no longer useful. If her favor waned, or if another woman caught the sultan's eye, Hatice knew that she had to secure her place, not just in the sultan's heart, but in the very structure of the empire itself. It was her role as the wife of Sultan Ahmed I that would give Hatice the platform she needed to influence the course of the empire. And she wasted no time in using this power. The challenges of ruling an empire were vast and complex, and the Sultan often found himself caught in the shifting tides of politics. The Janissaries, the powerful elite military group, were a constant presence in the empire's politics, and their support, or lack thereof, could make or break a ruler. The empire's various provinces were rife with unrest, and there were constant threats from rival states eager to carve out their own power in the region. As the wife of the Sultan, Hatice became a key advisor to Ahmed, offering him her insights and guidance. Her understanding of the court's inner workings, coupled with her ability to navigate the complex political landscape of the empire, made her a valuable ally to her husband. While many saw her as a figure of beauty and grace, it was her political acumen that truly set her apart. Hatice had the mind of a strategist, and she quickly became a trusted counselor to Sultan Ahmed I, helping him navigate the challenges that threatened the stability of the empire. In the midst of all the political intrigue, one thing remained clear: Hatice's position in the harem, and in the empire, was no longer fragile. She was a queen, a mother, and a powerful force in the Ottoman world. But her journey was only just beginning. As the years passed, she would face numerous trials. including the birth of her children, each of whom would play a crucial role in shaping the future of the empire. Through her marriage to Sultan Ahmed I, Hatice Kösem Sultan secured not only her own future but the future of the empire itself. But as history would show, power was always fleeting, and the forces that would shape the future were already in motion. Hatice's journey had just begun, and the trials she would face would prove that the road to power in the Ottoman Empire was never easy, no matter how great the woman who walked it. The days following Hatice Kösem Sultan's marriage to Sultan Ahmed I were filled with a sense of both quiet anticipation and the frenetic pace of palace life. The grand ceremonies, the rituals, and the celebrations were a constant reminder of the power and significance that now surrounded her. As the Sultan's wife, Hatice found herself at the heart of the empire's political and cultural life. Yet, beneath the exterior of grandeur and power, the true test of her influence lay in one of the most important roles she would ever fulfill, the role of a mother. In the world of the Ottoman harem, motherhood was more than a personal milestone, it was a political strategy. A weapon that could secure one's position and legacy. The birth of a child, especially a male heir, could elevate a woman to unimaginable heights within the palace. And for Hatice, who had already carved a place for herself with her intelligence and charm, the birth of her children would solidify her future and that of her family within the empire. As the months passed after her marriage, Hatice began to feel the weight of expectation upon her shoulders. The pressure to bear a son, to continue the royal bloodline and ensure the future of the empire, was immense. It was not just the Sultan who waited for an heir, the entire empire watched. For the birth of a male heir would signal stability in the empire. The Sultan's death could leave a vacuum of power, and securing an heir ensured that the empire would continue to thrive. The women of the harem, always watchful of each other, knew the significance of each child born and the importance of the royal bloodline. Finally, after a period of waiting, the news came. Hatice Kösem Sultan was pregnant, and the excitement that followed was palpable. It was not just her joy that filled the palace, but the collective hope of the empire. If she bore a son, the future of the Ottoman Empire would be secured under the guidance of her child. Hatice knew that this was her moment, her opportunity to rise even further in the intricate web of power that surrounded her. The labor was long and painful, but in the end, Hatice gave birth to a healthy son, Murad, named after his grandfather. The great Sultan Murad III was born into a world of great expectation. The moment the child's cries filled the air, Hatice felt a rush of emotion that she had never experienced before. But beneath the joy of motherhood, there was the recognition of what this child represented: power, security, and the future of the empire. In the days following the birth, the palace was filled with celebrations. The Sultan, overjoyed by the birth of his son, personally welcomed the child into the royal family. The courtiers and high-ranking officials of the empire paid their respects. Recognizing the significance of the event, Hatice was now more than just a wife, she was the mother of the future ruler of the Ottoman Empire. But the birth of Murad was not just a moment of personal triumph for Hatice. It was also a crucial step in her rise to political prominence. The birth of an heir to the throne was one of the most powerful positions a woman could hold in the empire. And Hatice knew that she now had a greater responsibility than ever before. Her son was not just a child, he was a political tool. A means of securing her place and her family's place in the empire. As a mother, Hatice was fiercely protective of her son. She ensured that Murad was given the finest education and that he was groomed for his future role as Sultan. The days of his early childhood were spent under the watchful eyes of his mother and the palace tutors, who taught him the art of governance, the intricacies of Ottoman law, and the history of the empire he would one day rule. Hatice, despite her own political ambitions, never lost sight of her son's welfare. She knew that Murad's success would ultimately be her success, and she poured all her energy into ensuring that he was prepared to take the throne when the time came. But as with any journey to power, Hatice's road was not without obstacles. The birth of Murad had brought her significant power, but it also brought her closer to the constant dangers and intrigues of palace life. The harem, a place of beauty and luxury, was also a battleground where women fought for position, for favor, and for control. Hatice, now a mother of the heir to the throne, became an even more formidable figure within the harem. Her rivals, aware of the power she wielded, began to plot against her. They whispered among themselves, eager to see her fall, to see her position crumble. They knew that in the harem, no one's position was ever truly secure, no matter how great their favor with the sultan. But Hatice, ever astute and calculating, understood the dangers she faced. She knew that the stakes had risen higher than ever before. The birth of her son had ensured her place in the empire. But it had also made her a target. She had to be vigilant, always watching for any sign of weakness or betrayal. And yet, as she looked down at her son, so innocent and pure in her arms, she was filled with determination. Murad was her future, and she would stop at nothing to ensure that he would rise to power and that her influence would remain unchallenged. The birth of Murad was only the beginning of Hatice's journey. As her son grew, so too did her power. The future of the Ottoman Empire, with all its complexities and challenges, now lay in her hands. She would navigate the treacherous politics of the harem and the palace with the same careful precision that had brought her to this point. And with each passing year, as Murad's influence grew and his reign drew nearer, Hatice would solidify her place as one of the most powerful women to ever step foot in the Ottoman palace. Her story was far from over. The birth of Murad had been a triumph, but it was only one chapter in a saga that would see Hatice Kösem Sultan rise to unprecedented heights of power. Her role as a mother, a queen, and a political force would shape the future of the empire in ways that no one could have predicted. And as the years went on, Hatice would prove that she was not merely a figurehead, but a true ruler in her own right. The winds of change swept through the palace with the passing of time, and none were more acutely felt than those that heralded the end of Sultan Ahmed I's reign. He had ascended to the throne as a young man, filled with ambition and a desire to bring glory to the Ottoman Empire. His reign had been marked by numerous challenges: war with Persia, the tensions with the Habsburgs, the internal power struggles of the empire, and the pressures of maintaining control over a vast and diverse realm. Yet, despite these struggles, Sultan Ahmed I had managed to preserve the integrity of the empire, securing its borders and maintaining its standing on the world stage. However, all of his efforts would soon come to an abrupt halt. Hatice Kösem Sultan had known, in the depths of her being, that the moment would eventually come when her husband's health would deteriorate. The Sultan was not an old man, but the pressures of the throne had begun to take their toll. The weight of ruling a vast empire, coupled with the personal losses and betrayals that come with life in the palace, had worn him down. His health began to decline rapidly, and with it, the stability of the empire seemed to waver. Sultan Ahmed I's illness was kept a closely guarded secret, but it was only a matter of time before the whispers in the halls of Topkapi Palace became louder, and the truth began to surface. Hatice, though the mother of the heir, understood the fragility of power. As the Sultan's condition worsened, the court was gripped by uncertainty, and the dangers of palace intrigue once again reared their heads. It was during the late spring of 1617 when Sultan Ahmed I's health took a severe turn for the worse. The palace physicians were at a loss, their attempts to restore the Sultan's strength proving futile. Hatice, ever vigilant, stood by her husband's side, offering him comfort and support. Yet, even she could not deny the inevitability of the situation. The Sultan's illness was not one he could recover from. She could see the shadow of death creeping closer. As the days turned into weeks, Sultan Ahmed I's condition worsened. Hatice knew that the time to act had arrived. She had long recognized that the empire's stability hinged not just on the Sultan's leadership, but on the ability of those around him to manage the affairs of the court in the wake of his passing. She was not blind to the power struggles that would unfold upon his death. She knew that the succession would be a volatile and dangerous time, where factions within the palace would vie for control of the empire. The death of the Sultan came quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the early hours of a spring morning. Hatice, ever the strategist, had prepared herself for this moment, though it did little to ease the heartbreak. She was not only the wife of the Sultan, she had shared with him the hopes and dreams of a united empire. She had built a family, and now, with his death, everything they had worked for was at risk. With the passing of Sultan Ahmed I, The Ottoman Empire was thrown into mourning. The streets of Istanbul were filled with the sound of mourning, the citizens weeping for their ruler. Inside the Topkapi Palace, however, the air was thick with uncertainty. Hatice, now a widow, stood at the center of this uncertainty. As the mother of the heir, she held the key to the future. But the future was far from certain. The game of power was about to intensify, and Hatice knew that she would need to be more than just the grieving widow. She had to become the protector of her son, Murad, and secure his future as the next sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Her first step was to secure Murad's place as the rightful heir. The death of Sultan Ahmed I had left a power vacuum. And though Murad was the sultan's eldest son, nothing was guaranteed in the cutthroat world of the palace. Factions were already forming, and rivals who once seemed loyal to the sultan now saw an opportunity to seize power for themselves. Hatice knew that it would take all of her cunning and strategic insight to navigate these dangerous waters. As the mourning period for Sultan Ahmed I came to a close, Hatice wasted no time in asserting her authority. She summoned the viziers, the military leaders, and the heads of the palace to meet with her in the grand halls of the Topkapi Palace. Her message was clear: her son, Murad, was the rightful heir to the throne, and she would fight for his succession, no matter the cost. The court was divided. Some supported Hatice, understanding that she was the mother of the heir and that her political acumen had guided the empire through many difficult times. Others, however, were more reluctant. They saw Murad as young and untested, and they feared that his reign would be marked by weakness and instability. In the shadows of the court, there were whispers of other potential candidates, uncles, cousins, and distant relatives, who might have a stronger claim to the throne. Hatice, ever the tactician, understood that she could not rely solely on her son's bloodline to secure his place. She needed allies, and she needed to neutralize any potential threats. Her first target was the Janissary Corps, the elite military force that held significant influence over the politics of the empire. With their support, she knew that Murad's ascension to the throne would be far more likely. Hatice worked tirelessly to secure their loyalty, using a combination of favors, promises, and subtle threats to ensure their backing. Meanwhile, the palace was in chaos. Courtiers plotted in secret, factions emerged, and tensions ran high. The fate of the empire hung in the balance, and the future of the throne seemed uncertain. But Hatice Kösem Sultan, with her sharp mind and unyielding determination, knew that she was in a race against time. She could not afford to falter. The stakes were higher than ever, and she would stop at nothing to secure her son's future as sultan. The days following Sultan Ahmed I's death were some of the most difficult of Hatice's life. But with every passing moment, she grew more resolute in her resolve. Her son, Murad, would not only survive the treacherous politics of the palace, he would thrive. And with him, she would ensure that the legacy of her husband would continue. As the power struggle in the palace raged on, one thing was certain: Hatice Kösem Sultan would stop at nothing to see her son crowned as the next sultan of the Ottoman Empire. She would face betrayal, opposition, and unimaginable challenges, but in the end, it would be her strength, her intelligence, and her unshakable will that would determine the fate of the empire. The day that Murad IV ascended the throne of the Ottoman Empire was one of both triumph and uncertainty. The empire, once under the steady hand of Sultan Ahmed I, had been thrown into chaos following his death. Palace intrigue, rivalries, and shifting allegiances had made the transition of power anything but smooth. But despite the turbulence, one thing was undeniable: Murad, the son of Hatice Kösem Sultan, was the rightful heir, and with his coronation, a new chapter in Ottoman history began. For Hatice, the ascension of her son marked the culmination of years of effort, strategy, and sacrifice. The road to this moment had been fraught with peril, and even with the throne now secured, there was no guarantee that the empire would remain stable. Murad, though a direct descendant of Sultan Ahmed I, was still young and untested. The power struggles within the palace, the simmering tensions among the military elite, and the ever-present threat of external enemies made his reign precarious at best. Hatice, however, was confident. She had secured Murad's place on the throne, and now it was her task to ensure that he would rule with strength and wisdom. Murad IV's ascension had been hard-won, and his early years on the throne were marked by a fierce determination to solidify his rule. As a young man, he lacked the experience and political savvy that his predecessors had possessed. But he more than made up for it with his fiery temper and unyielding resolve. Murad's reign would be one of contradictions. He was both ruthless and reformist. Tyrannical yet beloved by certain factions. A ruler capable of great cruelty and yet, at times, demonstrating an almost desperate desire to restore the Ottoman Empire to its former glory. The first challenge Murad faced was the powerful Janissary Corps, the elite military force that had long held sway over the empire. They were a force to be reckoned with, and any sultan who hoped to maintain his power needed their loyalty. Unfortunately for Murad, the Janissaries had become increasingly corrupt and unruly, and their influence had grown to a point where they could challenge the very authority of the sultan. Hatice, ever astute, recognized the danger posed by the Janissaries, and she knew that her son's reign would not be secure until their power was brought under control. In the early months of Murad's rule, Hatice worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure that the Janissaries did not threaten his reign. She played the delicate game of palace politics, using her influence to secure the loyalty of key military commanders and bureaucrats. Yet despite her best efforts, Murad's frustration with the Janissaries grew. He saw their disobedience and corruption as a direct threat to the empire's future. The sultan's young, fiery temper flared as he became increasingly impatient with the Janissaries' power. It was clear that Murad would not tolerate any faction within the empire that challenged his authority. Murad IV's response to the Janissary threat was swift and brutal. In a series of military campaigns and purges, he decisively defeated several factions of the Janissaries who had risen against him. His efforts to reassert his power included harsh crackdowns on corruption, heavy taxation, and a more direct military involvement in governing the empire. His actions were seen by some as necessary reforms, while others viewed them as the actions of a tyrant. However, there was no mistaking Murad's determination. He sought to restore the Ottoman Empire to its former strength, even if it meant employing draconian measures. Throughout this period, Hatice remained a steady presence by her son's side. She recognized the need for forceful leadership but also understood the importance of consolidating power through diplomacy and alliances. She worked tirelessly to maintain the delicate balance between reform and tradition, ensuring that the empire's internal stability remained intact. Her counsel to Murad, though sometimes ignored in favor of his more impetuous decisions, was invaluable. Hatice understood that the true strength of the empire lay not in brute force, but in a careful, calculated approach to governance. As Murad's reign progressed, the contradictions of his rule became even more apparent. On the one hand, he was a sultan who sought to rid the empire of its corruption, to restore discipline, and to strengthen its military. On the other hand, his volatile temper and penchant for cruelty made him a feared ruler, and his thirst for power often bordered on obsession. One of the most infamous aspects of Murad IV's reign was his enforcement of strict moral codes. He banned alcohol, opium, and coffee, enforcing these laws with a harsh hand. Those caught violating his edicts were punished severely, often by death. These measures, though aimed at restoring order to the empire, were seen by many as excessive and fueled further resentment. Despite the fear and anger his actions caused, Murad's reign was not without its successes. He successfully expanded the empire's borders and restored the military discipline that had been lacking under previous rulers. The empire, once again, became a formidable force in Europe and the Middle East. Yet the internal strife, the opposition to his rule, and the ever-present threat of rebellion weighed heavily on the sultan. Murad's mental state began to deteriorate under the pressures of ruling, and it was evident to those around him that the young sultan, for all his strength, was not immune to the pressures of the throne. Hatice Kösem Sultan, though proud of her son's achievements, was also deeply concerned by the toll that ruling had taken on him. She had always known the dangers of the throne, and she feared that Murad's volatile nature would eventually lead to his downfall. Yet, despite her worries, Hatice continued to stand by her son's side, guiding him as best as she could. She knew that the future of the empire depended on Murad's ability to rule with both strength and wisdom. And she hoped that with time, he would mature into the leader that the Ottoman Empire so desperately needed. As Murad IV's reign continued, the legacy of his rule became increasingly complex. He was remembered as a sultan who both restored the power of the empire and cast a dark shadow over it. His reign was marked by bloodshed and brutality, but also by remarkable victories and reforms. The empire, for all its internal struggles, remained a force to be reckoned with on the world stage. For Hatice Kösem Sultan, the reign of her son was both a triumph and a tragedy. She had secured the throne for Murad, but the challenges of ruling the Ottoman Empire were greater than she had ever imagined. The future of the empire, and of her son, hung in the balance, and she could only hope that the lessons of the past would guide them through the turbulent years ahead. The reign of Sultan Murad IV had set the stage for both military victories and deep instability within the palace. But as time went on, the Ottoman Empire found itself shifting yet again. From the volatile leadership of Murad IV to the arrival of a new sultan, one who would prove to be even more unpredictable, more fragile, and far more dangerous to the empire's future than anyone could have anticipated. This was the reign of Sultan Ibrahim I, a man whose weakness would become his downfall and whose very nature would stir up rebellion, chaos, and fear across the empire. Sultan Ibrahim I, unlike his elder brother Murad, was a man marked by emotional fragility and instability, while Murad had shown fierce resolve. Even in the most turbulent moments of his reign, Ibrahim's temperament was a complete contrast. He was prone to erratic mood swings, indulgence in luxury, and a lack of understanding of the empire's needs. His reign began not with the promise of strength, but with the sense that something was terribly wrong. Hatice Kösem Sultan, once a trusted advisor to her son Murad, now found herself embroiled in the challenges of managing an empire governed by a ruler who lacked the self-control, wisdom, and strength required of a sultan. When Sultan Ibrahim ascended the throne, he was immediately surrounded by those who saw his vulnerability as an opportunity. The power vacuum left by Murad's volatile reign created a fertile ground for court conspiracies, with officials, military leaders, and other factions seeking to position themselves at the forefront of the empire's affairs. The young sultan, having been shielded from the harsh realities of governance for much of his life, lacked the skill or understanding to manage the palace's intrigue. Ibrahim was, in many ways, more childlike than his brother, and this would come to define the challenges he faced during his rule. Hatice Kösem Sultan, still holding influence within the palace, quickly understood that the reign of her second son would be a complex and dangerous one. Unlike Murad, Ibrahim did not have the force of character that could command loyalty or instill fear in his enemies. His mind was often consumed by indulgences, luxury, excess, and a desire for comfort rather than the hard work of empire building. These traits led him to make decisions that not only alienated the most important figures in his court but also created an unstable environment where rebellion was waiting to bloom. The first sign of Ibrahim's faltering rule came when he began making decisions based on whims rather than reason. He lavishly spent the empire's wealth on grandiose projects and celebrations that drained the state's treasury. The military, long a pillar of Ottoman power, found itself undermined by the Sultan's disregard for discipline. The Janissaries, once a symbol of strength and loyalty, grew restless under Ibrahim's leadership. Sensing the weak foundations of his rule, the palace, once a place of absolute power, became a space filled with rumors and unrest. As the months went by, Ibrahim's indulgence in his desires grew more pronounced. He ordered executions without cause, removed loyal officials from their posts, and allowed corruption to run rampant throughout the court. His emotional instability led him to believe that everyone around him was plotting against him, and he became increasingly paranoid. Hatice, who had once guided her sons through the intricate politics of the palace, now found herself powerless to steer Ibrahim's reign in the right direction. Despite her best efforts to advise him, Ibrahim's disconnection from reality and his obsession with luxury made him less inclined to listen to the wisdom of his mother. Hatice had always been a pragmatic woman, understanding the importance of maintaining alliances and stability in the empire. But with Ibrahim, She found herself in a frustrating position. He was not only erratic in his decision-making but also distant, often retreating into a world of excess and pleasure that separated him from the realities of governing. By the time Ibrahim reached his third year on the throne, his reign had plunged into crisis. The financial health of the empire had been severely compromised by his reckless spending, and the empire's military strength had been weakened by the discontent of the Janissaries. Ibrahim's lack of discipline and his inability to communicate effectively with the court had driven many key figures to begin conspiring against him. Hatice, once a powerful figure in the palace, now found herself caught in the middle of a growing conflict between her loyalty to her son and the demands of the empire. The tipping point came when Ibrahim's actions led to an uprising among the Janissaries. They had been quietly growing dissatisfied with the Sultan's rule, and when Ibrahim began cutting back on their privileges and failing to pay them their due wages, their discontent boiled over. The Janissaries, who had once been the backbone of the empire's military might, now turned against their ruler. They demanded action, and Ibrahim, in his weakened state, was unable to calm the storm he had unwittingly unleashed. The rebellion of the Janissaries was swift and brutal. As the unrest spread throughout the palace, Ibrahim found himself cornered. The factions that had long been waiting for an opportunity to overthrow him now seized their chance. In a shocking turn of events, the Sultan was deposed, and the Janissaries, who had once been loyal to the throne, declared that Ibrahim was unfit to rule. The once mighty Sultan was now a prisoner within his own palace, his fate sealed by his own inability to govern. Hatice Kösem Sultan, devastated by the fall of her son, found herself in a position that she had hoped to avoid. The palace was in disarray, and the empire stood on the brink of further chaos. With Ibrahim's deposition, the Ottomans faced the threat of even greater instability, and Hatice was left to pick up the pieces. Her son, once destined to carry the mantle of the empire's leadership, had faltered and fallen. His reign, marked by indulgence and misrule, had come to a tragic end. The political landscape was now ripe for a new leader. And once again, the name of Murad, the older son of Hatice, was raised as a possible candidate to reclaim the throne. Murad's reign had been marked by brutality, but his ruthlessness was now seen as a necessary strength in a time when the empire needed strong leadership to restore order. Hatice, having lived through the turmoil of Murad's reign and the disastrous fall of Ibrahim, understood that the future of the Ottoman Empire rested on her ability to guide her surviving son back to power. But as she prepared to navigate yet another period of palace intrigue and political instability, Hatice Kösem Sultan knew that the future of the empire could no longer be taken for granted. With Ibrahim's fall, the empire had been shaken to its core, and the road ahead was fraught with danger. Hatice's strength would once again be tested, and her legacy as one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history would be determined by how well she could guide the empire through its darkest days. The fall of Ibrahim the One had cast a dark shadow over the palace. But in its wake, a new opportunity for power had emerged. Hatice Kösem Sultan, who had spent the years since the death of her husband, Sultan Ahmed I, deftly guiding her sons through the treacherous political waters of the Ottoman court, now found herself standing at a precipice once again. The empire, with all its complexities and fractured loyalties, was in need of a decisive leader. Murad IV, her firstborn, had been cruel but effective. Ibrahim, her second son, had failed tragically. Now, the question of who would steer the empire toward stability was once again at the forefront of the court's attention. Hatice, ever pragmatic, understood that in the volatile world of the Ottoman palace, power was not handed over, power was seized. Her son Murad, though known for his erratic behavior during his reign, was still the strongest contender. He was a man who had shown great resolve, even if it had been tainted with cruelty. For all his flaws, Murad was the heir to the throne, and his return to power was a matter of inevitability, at least in the eyes of those who believed the Ottoman Empire needed a strong leader to restore its former glory. The reinstatement of Murad IV as Sultan was not without complications. The Janissaries, who had overthrown Ibrahim, were wary of the ruthless tactics that Murad had employed in his previous reign. They had risen against Ibrahim's incompetence, but they were equally wary of Murad's ability to restore order through brute force. Hatice knew that her son would need to balance his hardline tactics with careful diplomacy. The Janissaries, though eager for stability, could not be treated lightly. They had seen firsthand how unchecked power could lead to the downfall of a sultan. And they would demand a price for their loyalty. Hatice's first move in her son's reinstatement was one of careful diplomacy. She met with key figures of the Janissaries, military leaders, and high-ranking officials, though her son was known for his fiery temper and his cruelty. Hatice was still a respected figure in the palace. Her counsel was sought after, and her political acumen was recognized. She used this influence to secure Murad's return to the throne, appealing to the Janissaries with promises of reform and respect. They would be made a crucial part of the empire's leadership once again. And Murad's reign would not follow the same path of excess and instability that had plagued Ibrahim's rule. But even as Hatice worked behind the scenes, she knew that the greatest challenge lay not in the political maneuvering of the palace, but in Murad himself. Her son, though powerful, was unstable. His penchant for cruelty and his tendency to act without thought were well known. The Sultan, in his desire to reassert his control over the empire, had become something of a tyrant. His reign had begun with promises of discipline and reform, but soon his need for control overpowered his better judgment. Murad began to impose harsh punishments, restricting the freedoms of his subjects and indulging in vices once more. Hatice, deeply concerned for her son and the future of the empire, found herself walking a thin line between loyalty to her child and the survival of the empire. She knew that Murad's rule, as it stood, could lead to another rebellion. The Janissaries, the military elite that had once supported his return to the throne, began to grow restless once again. Murad's violent tendencies were beginning to alienate those who had initially supported him. He imposed harsh laws, outlawed certain practices, and even went so far as to execute those who disrespected his authority. His erratic behavior was causing tension, and the whispers of rebellion began to echo throughout the palace. Hatice understood that her son needed a new direction, one that would lead the empire into stability while allowing Murad to retain his position of power. She sought to remind him of the lessons he had learned during his earlier reign, the necessity of balance and discipline, the importance of unity among the different factions of the empire. Yet, Murad was not one to listen to reason, and his temper, once again, flared. Hatice had never been afraid to confront her sons when necessary, and she was not afraid now. In a tense meeting with Murad, Hatice laid bare her concerns. She told him of the unrest within the palace, the growing dissatisfaction of the Janissaries, and the fear that another rebellion could occur if his reign continued on its current path. She reminded him of the legacy of his grandfather, Sultan Ahmed I, a man whose wisdom and judgment had kept the empire strong. Murad, still consumed by his desire for power, was reluctant to heed her advice, but the weight of her words seemed to reach him. Realizing that his own actions were threatening the stability of the empire, Murad began to temper his approach. Albeit reluctantly, he agreed to some reforms, mostly aimed at placating the Janissaries and restoring the empire's military discipline. Yet, Murad's reforms were still marked by a heavy hand, though he would give his promises. He would never truly relinquish the power that defined him. This would not be a reign of peace, but one of compromise, a delicate balance between authoritarian rule and necessary concessions. Hatice, meanwhile, continued to play a crucial role in Murad's reign. Her influence in the palace, her diplomatic skill, and her ability to navigate the ever-changing tides of politics made her an invaluable advisor. As the mother of the Sultan, she had a position of respect and authority that few others could claim. But her influence was not without challenges. The palace was rife with intrigue, and rivals sought to undermine her efforts at every turn. Despite the external opposition, Hatice remained steadfast in her support of her son. She knew that without her intervention, the empire would once again spiral into chaos. It was not just her son's future she was protecting, but the future of the empire itself. The stakes were high, and Hatice understood the risks that came with playing such a dangerous game. As Murad IV's reign continued, Hatice Kösem Sultan's role became more prominent. Her efforts to restore balance to the empire, to manage the court's complex politics, and to guide her son through the difficult challenges of leadership proved invaluable. The empire, though still fragile, began to stabilize under Murad's reign. His harshness had tempered, his cruelty dialed back, and for a brief period, peace reigned once again. Hatice's legacy as a political force was solidified. She had not only helped her son rise to power but had ensured that the empire would survive its darkest days. However, the triumph of Hatice Kösem Sultan was bittersweet. Her son, though ultimately a stabilizing force, had not been the ruler the empire had hoped for. His reign, though marked by a degree of order, had also left deep scars. Hatice, ever the pragmatic ruler, had helped steer the empire through the storms. But she knew that power, like everything else, was fragile. The future of the Ottoman Empire would depend on the next generation. And Hatice knew that she could only guide them so far. Her legacy was one of both triumph and tragedy, a reminder of the delicate balance of power and the sacrifices that came with it. As the years passed, the Ottoman Empire, under Sultan Murad IV, began to find its footing again. His earlier reign, marked by ruthless crackdowns and a fierce desire to reassert control, had transformed into a period of relative stability. Murad's reforms, though hard-fought, brought the empire closer to what it had been during the height of its power. Yet, despite the outward appearance of order, one of the most potent forces in the empire remained ever watchful: the Janissaries. The Janissary Corps, once the backbone of the Ottoman military, had evolved from a disciplined, loyal force into a powerful political entity within the empire. Their influence over the Sultanate had grown exponentially over the centuries, and their power was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they were the keepers of the military strength of the empire, and on the other, they were a force that could destabilize the very foundations of the Sultanate if left unchecked. Murad, a ruler who had experienced firsthand the power of the Janissaries, knew that his ability to maintain control of the empire depended, in part, on his relationship with this military force. However, the Janissaries were not easily subdued, and they had never been loyal to any sultan without careful consideration of their own interests. Hatice Kösem Sultan, ever keen to the subtleties of the palace's inner workings, knew that while her son had won the throne and established his rule, the Janissaries still held too much sway. If Murad's rule were to remain secure, the Janissaries would need to be tamed, either through alliance or through force. The question was not whether Murad could control them, but how long he could keep the balance between loyalty and fear intact. At first, Murad attempted to manage the Janissaries through diplomatic means. He began offering them greater rewards, increasing their privileges, and seeking to build a cooperative relationship with the core. However, the Janissaries, who were used to being courted by sultans, saw these concessions as signs of weakness. They had grown accustomed to receiving power, wealth, and influence, and Murad's attempts to placate them were met with skepticism and disdain. The Janissaries believed that their loyalty could be bought with promises, but it was ultimately their power, not their loyalty, that ruled their actions. Tensions between Murad IV and the Janissaries quickly reached a boiling point. The core had become increasingly corrupt, with many of its members using their influence to amass wealth, often exploiting their power for personal gain. The once proud and disciplined military force had degenerated into an entity marked by political scheming, greed, and infighting. Murad, determined to rid the empire of this corruption, began to impose stricter regulations on the Janissaries, which led to fierce resentment among their ranks. His anger toward their excesses grew as he realized that the Janissaries' power was undermining the very strength of the empire. Hatice, ever the strategist, saw the brewing conflict as inevitable. The Janissaries, once the protectors of the Sultan's reign, were now a growing threat to the empire's stability. She knew that her son's desire to impose order on them could lead to open rebellion, and the cost of such a rebellion would be high. It was a delicate balancing act, and Hatice understood that any wrong move could push the empire into further chaos. Murad, in his frustration, turned to more drastic measures. His earlier purges, which had eliminated corrupt officials and weakened his rivals, now extended to the Janissaries. In a series of brutal crackdowns, Murad had several high-ranking members of the core executed for their insubordination and greed. The execution of the Janissary leaders sent a shockwave through the corps and struck fear into their ranks. However, rather than restoring order, Murad's actions had the opposite effect. The Janissaries, enraged by their loss of leadership, began to organize against him. The rebellion that followed was swift and brutal. The Janissaries, though weakened by Murad's earlier measures, still commanded a significant portion of the military. They rallied behind a new leader, a young officer named Mehmed Aga, who became the face of the Janissary resistance. Mehmed Aga promised to restore the honor and power of the Janissaries and overthrow the Sultan who had humiliated them. The rebellion quickly spread through the streets of Istanbul, with the Janissaries storming the palace and demanding that Murad IV be dethroned. Hatice Kösem Sultan, who had worked tirelessly to ensure her son's reign, now found herself in a precarious position. As the rebellion raged outside the palace walls, she was once again called upon to use all her political acumen and influence to prevent further bloodshed. In these desperate times, Hatice recognized the full extent of the power of the Janissaries. Their resistance was not just a matter of military might, it was a statement of the political reality of the empire. If Murad were to continue as sultan, the Janissaries would need to be dealt with. If they were allowed to retain their power, the empire would continue to fracture. Hatice took swift action. She called upon her connections within the court and sent emissaries to negotiate with the Janissary leaders. A delicate truce was proposed, one that promised some of their demands would be met in exchange for their loyalty. It was a dangerous game, but Hatice understood the importance of compromise in moments like these. The Janissaries, though angry, had little choice but to accept the terms, however reluctantly. They were not in a position to overthrow Murad completely, and Hatice's role as mediator proved invaluable in keeping the peace, even if temporarily. With the Janissaries momentarily appeased, Murad IV was able to retain his throne, but the peace was fragile. The rebellion had left its mark, and though Murad had won the day, he knew that his position remained vulnerable. Hatice had once again secured stability for her son, but she also knew that this truce would not last forever. The Janissaries were a powerful and volatile force, and it was only a matter of time before their dissatisfaction with the Sultan's rule flared up once again. In the days following the conflict, Hatice continued to advise Murad on how to restore the empire's order. She counseled him to consider not just the Janissaries but the broader picture, how the military, the court, and the people of the empire saw him. Murad was still too consumed with his own authority to see the full scope of his actions. But Hatice understood that her son's reign would continue to be shaped by the delicate balance of power, fear, and respect. Her influence, while crucial, was limited. Hatice's victory in quelling the Janissary rebellion had been a short-term solution, one that only bought the empire a temporary reprieve. The Janissaries would not easily forget the humiliation they had suffered, and their desire for power remained unchecked. The question of how Murad IV would deal with the Janissaries, and whether the empire could remain united, was still unanswered. Hatice, however, had played her part in saving her son's reign once again. The conflict with the Janissaries had been a defining moment in her legacy, proving that, even in the face of rebellion and opposition, her political skill and determination could secure the empire's future. Yet, she knew that the road ahead would continue to be fraught with challenges. The Janissaries, the political factions within the palace, and the shifting loyalties of the military all posed constant threats to Murad's rule. As the empire moved forward, Hatice's role remained pivotal. Though the outcome was far from certain, she knew that the empire's survival depended on her ability to navigate the labyrinth of court politics, appease the powerful factions, and, most importantly, keep her son on the throne. The Ottoman Empire, despite all its internal chaos and political maneuvering, was a force to be reckoned with on the world stage. However, the turmoil that brewed within the palace threatened to unravel everything that had been fought for, particularly as the struggle for power continued in the heart of the empire, Topkapi Palace. The Janissary crisis had passed, but it left behind a bitter taste of the instability that threatened the throne. For Hatice Kösem Sultan, her greatest challenge was no longer just managing the political and military powers but also navigating the dangerous waters of palace intrigue. where betrayal could come from any direction, even from within her own family. Though she had successfully secured Murad IV's position as sultan after his reign had nearly fallen apart due to the Janissaries' revolt, Hatice knew that her influence within the palace had grown precarious. There were those who believed that she held too much power, that her grip on the throne through her sons was threatening to overshadow the sultan's authority. Among the rising voices of dissent was one individual who posed the most significant threat to Hatice's continued influence, a fellow noblewoman and rival within the palace. Safiye Sultan. Safiye Sultan, a woman of great ambition and cunning, had been one of the strongest and most influential figures in the empire for years. A widow of Sultan Murad III, she had once been the sultan's favorite consort, bearing him children who had significant claims to the throne. She had wielded great influence during the reign of her son, Sultan Mehmed III, and after his death, had continued to exert control over palace affairs, carefully maneuvering to maintain her political power even after the passing of her royal consort. As the influence of her sons waned, Safiye turned her eyes to other avenues to gain control. However, Safiye's aspirations and her thirst for power led her into direct conflict with Hatice Kösem Sultan. Hatice had always managed the palace with great care, using her wisdom and understanding of court politics to maintain her family's power. Yet, Safiye saw Hatice as an obstacle, a rival who threatened her own position as the most powerful woman in the palace. The idea of sharing or yielding power to another was anathema to Safiye, and she had no intention of letting Hatice rise further, especially with the significant sway she already held over Murad IV. Their rivalry, rooted in ambition and old grudges, simmered quietly for a while. Both women knew the stakes. Whomever controlled the sultan's ear controlled the empire. As Hatice's power grew with her son's continued rule, Safiye realized that Hatice was more than just a mother advising her son. Hatice was a political mastermind in her own right, and that threatened everything Safiye had worked for in the harem. With her own position weakening, Safiye made a fateful decision to act decisively, choosing to eliminate the source of her greatest concern, Hatice Kösem Sultan. Safiye's plan to eliminate Hatice was subtle and layered, designed to undermine her through manipulation and the use of those within the court who were loyal to Safiye's interests. She began to weave a network of whispers, planting seeds of doubt about Hatice's loyalty among the high-ranking officials in the palace. She played on Murad's insecurities, using the sultan's volatile temperament against him. Safiye spread rumors that Hatice was attempting to gain too much influence, manipulating the court for her own advantage. In doing so, Safiye aimed to isolate Hatice from her political allies and bring the full weight of the sultan's authority down upon her. However, Hatice Kösem Sultan was not easily deceived. She had survived countless challenges in the palace, overcoming rivals, court conspiracies, and the shifting allegiances of her sons. She had built her reputation on her sharp intellect, and she knew that the rumors swirling around her were no mere accident. She understood that Safiye was behind them, and she knew the potential danger of underestimating her rival. Hatice was keenly aware that a direct confrontation would leave her vulnerable. So instead, she decided to outmaneuver Safiye in the most dangerous way possible, through calculated diplomacy, alliances, and by strengthening her own ties to the military. Despite her best efforts, however, the pressure mounted. The sultan was torn, swayed by the whispers of Safiye and others who were beginning to call for Hatice's removal. Murad IV, already grappling with the pressures of his own rule, began to withdraw from his mother's counsel. He sought the advice of other members of the court, including those who were loyal to Safiye, further diminishing Hatice's power. The fateful turning point came during a night of feasting and celebration in the palace. The court had gathered for a lavish banquet to mark the end of a successful military campaign. It was in the midst of this gathering that Safiye made her move. With Murad distracted by the festivities, Safiye made use of the growing division between the two women. She orchestrated a final plot, one that would end Hatice's life and solidify her own power once and for all. A carefully planned assassination was carried out under the cover of darkness. Hatice Kösem Sultan, a woman who had navigated the political labyrinth of the Ottoman Empire for decades, was taken from the palace by those whom she had trusted. The conspirators acted swiftly, ensuring that no one would notice until it was too late. By the time her body was discovered, it was clear that the end of Hatice's reign had come, and the empire was once again thrown into uncertainty. The assassination of Hatice Kösem Sultan reverberated throughout the palace. News of her death spread quickly, and the court was left in shock. For some, her passing signaled the end of an era, a time when a woman held unparalleled influence in the empire. To others, it marked the triumph of Safiye Sultan, who would now hold the reins of power once again. But while Safiye may have won the battle, the long-term consequences of Hatice's death would prove to be far-reaching. Hatice had been the keystone that held together the fragile political alliances of the empire. With her gone, a vacuum of power quickly began to form, and the once strong and unified court began to fracture once again. Murad IV, weakened by his own inability to act decisively, found that without his mother's guidance, the empire began to unravel. The military once again grew restless, and the Janissaries, emboldened by Hatice's removal, began to question the stability of the throne. Hatice Kösem Sultan's legacy, though tragically cut short, would not be easily forgotten. Her influence over the empire, the strength she brought to her family, and her ability to manipulate the palace's political intricacies had cemented her as one of the most formidable women in Ottoman history. Safiye may have gained temporary control, but the seeds of discontent had already been sown, and the empire would soon face the consequences of removing one of its most powerful figures. The death of Hatice Kösem Sultan sent shockwaves through the halls of Topkapi Palace. Her passing marked not just the end of an era for the Ottoman Empire, but the beginning of a new chapter of uncertainty. With her gone, the balance of power within the palace shifted once again, and the ramifications of her assassination reverberated throughout the empire. Safiye Sultan, having orchestrated the fatal blow to her rival, celebrated her momentary triumph. She had finally succeeded in eliminating the one woman who had stood between her and absolute power. No longer would Hatice's influence over her sons or the imperial court stand in her way. The Sultan, Murad IV, though mourning his mother's death, was now under Safiye's influence, and she began to take control of the decisions that shaped the empire's future. Yet, as often happens with those who achieve power through treachery, Safiye's victory was hollow. The very act of eliminating her rival created a void of power within the palace, and the consequences of her ambitions soon became evident. The empire, though still vast, was already strained by the political tensions that had existed for years. Murad IV, though relieved from the immediate influence of his mother, was not the ruler his empire needed. His reign was characterized by his cruel authoritarianism and reckless behavior. His inability to rein in his desires for control left a fragile balance within the palace, and the court was filled with intrigue and whispers of rebellion. Safiye, now the de facto ruler behind the throne, faced immediate challenges. While she had managed to secure Murad's position temporarily, she knew that the Janissaries, still a powerful force in Ottoman politics, would not easily be swayed by her schemes. The military had been divided by the previous years of unrest, and the instability created by her own actions was starting to unravel the fragile truce she had orchestrated. She understood that her control over the empire was tenuous at best, and the threat of rebellion was never far off. As Safiye consolidated her power, her grip on the Sultanate became increasingly strained. The Janissaries, despite their loyalty to the throne, were divided on how to deal with the rise of Safiye. While some saw her as a necessary force to maintain stability, others viewed her as an outsider, a woman who had taken power by bloodshed and deceit. The Janissaries had long been accustomed to a system in which the Sultan ruled with the guidance of trusted advisors. But with Safiye now acting as the true power behind the throne, their trust in the system was faltering. As the Janissaries grew restless, so too did the courtiers within the palace. Hatice's death had left a power vacuum, and many believed that the empire needed a stronger ruler, one who could stabilize the kingdom and restore its former glory. Some even began to whisper that the return of a new sultan, perhaps a more capable and stable heir, would be the only solution to the growing instability. The whispers of rebellion reached Murad IV's ears, but his paranoia and suspicion, already heightened by his emotional instability, led him to view these discussions as treason. The Sultan, with Safi's guidance, began a series of harsh crackdowns on those who were perceived as a threat. But the deeper he dug, the more he alienated those around him. The Janissaries, once loyal to the throne, began to question their allegiance to a ruler who was both cruel and unbalanced. In the midst of all this turmoil, a dangerous plot began to take shape within the palace. The Janissaries, frustrated by Murad's erratic behavior, began to make plans to replace him with a more stable leader. While the military leaders and high-ranking officials remained publicly loyal to the Sultan, many saw Murad's reign as a threat to the very stability of the empire. The seeds of rebellion were sown, and it was only a matter of time before the empire would be thrown into further chaos. Safiye, who had once been the architect of Murad's reign, now found herself facing a rebellion that she could not control. The power she had so carefully cultivated began to slip through her fingers. The Janissaries, led by a faction of rebellious officers, marched to the palace gates, demanding the Sultan's removal. The once strong military force that had supported her rise now threatened to tear apart the fragile empire. Desperate to maintain control, Safiye sought refuge in the very palace that had been her seat of power. She gathered her loyalists and strategized how to fend off the advancing rebellion. But the Janissaries, emboldened by their previous success, were relentless. They demanded that Murad IV be removed from the throne, and Safiye knew that she was no longer in a position to protect him. In a final, dramatic turn of events, Safi's influence was shattered. The Janissaries stormed the palace, and Murad IV was captured. His reign, though marked by moments of strength and cruelty, had come to an abrupt and tragic end. His death, orchestrated by those who had once supported him, signified the collapse of the power structure that Safiye had worked so hard to build. The rebellion had succeeded, and the empire was left without its ruler. The fall of Murad IV marked a turning point in the history of the Ottoman Empire. The Janissaries, now emboldened by their success, began to reshape the empire's future. Safiye, who had once been the architect of the Sultan's reign, was now nothing more than a fallen power. Her once vast influence had crumbled in the face of rebellion and palace intrigue. But even in the wake of her fall, the legacy of Hatice Kösem Sultan lived on. Though she had been assassinated by Safi's schemes, her political genius and unwavering determination had shaped the very foundations of the Ottoman Empire. Hatice's influence was felt in the rise of Murad IV, in the eventual rebellion that had toppled him, and in the future direction of the empire. Her wisdom, her ability to navigate the dangers of court politics, and her commitment to securing her family's place in the empire had created a legacy that could not easily be erased. As the dust settled on Murad IV's reign and Safi's fall from power, the Ottoman Empire found itself at a crossroads. The forces that had shaped the empire's politics, the Janissaries, the palace factions, the military, and the political elites, would continue to vie for control. The question of who would emerge as the next ruler was one that loomed large. But for now, the legacy of Hatice Kösem Sultan would remain a touchstone for all those who sought to wield power in the empire. The fall of Sultan Murad IV and the downfall of Safiye Sultan marked a profound turning point in the Ottoman Empire. But it was the memory of one woman, Hatice Kösem Sultan, that lingered in the halls of the palace and in the minds of those who survived the chaos. Despite the power struggles, betrayals, and bloodshed that marked the final years of her family's reign, the legacy of Kösem Sultan was a constant reminder of the empire's former stability, its strength, and the woman who had once held it all together. Her death had come at the hands of a rival, a woman who sought to seize control of the empire through manipulation and deceit. But despite Safi's temporary triumph, the aftermath of her actions demonstrated the power of Kösem Sultan's enduring influence. Hatice had been a force unlike any other in the empire. Her intellect, her ability to navigate the shifting tides of palace politics, and her unwavering loyalty to her family had ensured her place as one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history. Kösem Sultan had shaped the empire not just through her control over her sons, but through her ability to stabilize and guide the empire during one of its most tumultuous periods. Her political acumen was legendary, and even in death, Her legacy would continue to define the path of the empire for years to come. The rebellion that had led to Murad IV's downfall and Safi's fall was proof that her actions, her wisdom, her alliances, and her diplomacy had created a foundation for stability that could not be easily shaken. In the months and years following Murad's death, the Ottoman Empire entered yet another period of political flux. New rulers would rise, each with their own ambitions and vision for the future. Yet, none would be able to claim the same kind of control over the empire that Hatice Kösem Sultan had wielded. Even as new sultans came to power, the memory of her strategic brilliance and the balance she had brought to the empire was still felt. For her sons, particularly Sultan Ibrahim I and Sultan Murad IV, Hatice had always been the guiding force behind their reigns, whether they acknowledged it or not. Though Murad IV had been a harsh and often cruel ruler, his reign was shaped by the lessons his mother had instilled in him. Ibrahim, though weaker and ultimately deposed, had been pushed onto the throne by his mother's influence, and it was her strength that had kept him there for a time. The court, now devoid of the stability that Hatice had once provided, descended into further chaos. The Janissaries, once placated by Hatice's subtle diplomacy, began to demand more power. The military factions that had supported her sons now turned against each other, seeking new alliances, and the power that had once been so carefully controlled began to splinter. Yet, even as the empire teetered on the brink of collapse, the legacy of Hatice Kösem Sultan remained firmly embedded in the empire's political structure. The principles she had championed, strategic alliances, the importance of family, and the value of leadership through wisdom, remained relevant to every new ruler who took the throne. In the eyes of those who had known her, Hatice Kösem Sultan was not simply a mother to the sultan. She was a symbol of power in a world that often underestimated the influence women could wield. Her legacy served as a reminder that the true strength of the Ottoman Empire lay not just in the might of its military but in the cunning and political acumen of those who understood how to manipulate the web of power that ran through its veins. She had known that true power was not a matter of brute force, it was a matter of understanding the game, playing it strategically, and always keeping an eye on the future. Though her life had been cut short by the treacherous ambitions of a rival, Hatice Kösem Sultan's legacy would continue to influence the future of the Ottoman Empire. Every new ruler who rose to power would be reminded of her remarkable ability to hold the reins of an empire and the sheer determination that had allowed her to secure her family's future in the palace. No ruler would ever forget that the strength of the empire could be maintained, not by force alone, but through the wisdom of those who understood the delicate balance of power. As the centuries passed and the Ottoman Empire eventually came to an end, Hatice Kösem Sultan remained a figure of history whose impact could not be erased. Historians would recount her life as one of ambition, strategy, and unparalleled strength, a woman who had, for a time, held the fate of an empire in her hands. Her name would endure not only as a mother and wife but as a master of the intricate and dangerous art of governance. In the end, Hatice Kösem Sultan's life was a testament to the idea that power, even when fleeting, could be shaped by wisdom and a keen understanding of the world's most perilous game. And though she had passed from this world, her influence, like the empire she had once helped to guide, would remain.